Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, Benny. I'm great, man. I mixed a pop punk song the other week, or maybe that was last week. Yeah, last week, and I had so much fun. Pop punk's so much fun. I'm just so glad that music exists again.
Yes, it is. Yes, totally. It's a lot of fun. What was it? Like, can you say the band?
Yep, her name is Darian Gerard, and actually I shared the mix with you now that I think about it, Benny.
Oh yeah, is that one?
You
Yeah,
gave me some
that was
some
cool.
good feedback on that, and I think that those notes really helped actually get it to exactly where we wanted it.
Great. Nice.
And yeah, just high energy music, and pop punk's so magical because like the arrangements just like lend themselves to good sounding mixes. Like everything just has its little place, and it's all high energy. The drum beats are catchy. Like it's just all a win to me. I know some people despise that music, but I love it.
Yeah, I had to learn to love it. Or actually, honestly, I think deep inside me, I always loved it, but I couldn't admit
I think people
that
just got to
loved
admit
it.
they love it.
Yeah, totally. Like I was like, there was no way I would have admitted that, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, when we listened to real, quote unquote, real punk bands, you know?
Mhm.
But then at some point I didn't care anymore at all. And now I'm proudly telling everybody that I love those bands. And I always did, but I just wasn't willing to admit, you know? I can listen to Avril Lavigne or something even. And think
Honestly,
like,
just threw on her new album because she's making a comeback right now, and I was like, okay, I got to check this out. There's some banger songs on there. Well done, Avril.
Definitely.
A Canadian treasure yet again.
Yes, definitely. And also like totally unrelated to everything now, but what I found interesting is like it's been like, I don't know, 20 years, 25 years almost since she first released something, and her voice sounds just like it sounded back then, and she looks just like she looked back then. It's almost like time has, there's no, there was like,
She
there's
just
almost
went
no
to a
time in
capsule.
between that. Yeah, really, honestly, it's like the same thing.
Have you heard, this is such a stupid thing to talk about on the podcast, I'm sorry everyone, but have you heard of the Avril Lavigne is dead conspiracy?
I definitely heard of that. It's been a while, but I definitely heard of that, and I thought it was hilarious. Yeah, totally. Just look that up, people. You will find it. Just Google that if you're interested.
We won't go
That's
down
a
that
funny
road.
thing. No, but yeah, I've definitely heard it. Yeah. I forgot about it, but yes.
People are crazy, man.
People are really crazy, yeah. And they go down these rabbit holes and do all the research to prove their point, and it's so crazy, yeah.
Yeah, I think they overestimate the power of the music industry in that case, but
yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Anyway, but gotta love pop punk. So, and I love that mix, by the way. I, as you said, I gave you a little bit of feedback. Well, it wasn't much because it didn't need much. So, at least I thought so, and I really enjoyed it. And it's fun to mix. Definitely, I love to do those things.
Yeah. Darian signed off on the mix. We're finished, and more songs on the way. So
awesome, really,
gonna be fun.
Really, really, really cool. So to sort of get to today's topic of the episode, did you use any multiband compression in there?
You know what? I did. I think on one thing, which is my most common use of it. Yeah. But listeners, we are talking about when and how to use multiband compression. That is our topic for this. It's so heavily requested, and we've like begrudgingly avoided it, I think, because we don't think it's that important. But it is finally like we just have to address it and explain why it's not that important. Maybe I don't know. I feel like education will get people to stop thinking about it so much. And what I mean by that is that it's, for some reason, multiband compression just sounds magical or something, and people seem to think that it's this little like magic fix everything tool, and or maybe not fix everything tool, but is the secret to things sounding professional, and having pro mixes, and that's just not the case at all. That's like having a lighter is the secret to having a bonfire or something. It's like, well, it'll help you start a fire, but like there's other things involved. I don't know. It's the weirdest analogy I could have chosen, but I don't know if bonfires are popular in Germany, but
they are for sure. I just don't think that a multi-band compression typically starts a fire when it comes to mixes, but.
It can set your mix on fire in a bad way.
That's true. That's for sure. That's true. Yeah, but I totally get what you're saying. So it seems and I actually would love to know where that came from. Why do people think that it's sort of the secret sauce and the secret ingredient and what the thing you have to do? Maybe it's because it's rather complicated, and they think because they don't understand it, it must be something that the pros can do that they cannot do. Maybe that's part of the reason.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
And I do want to say that I'm like, despite all of what I just said, neither Benny or I are anti multiband compression.
No.
It's a great tool, fantastic. I'm so glad it exists. But it's just not anything different than any other tool, really. At the end of the day, it's just a tool that does multiband compression. So when do we use it? When we want multiband compression.
Exactly.
Right? It's really that simple. But I guess you have to understand what multiband compression is for that any of this to make sense.
Yeah.
So where do we start, Benny?
Yeah, I love what you just said. When do we use it? When we use it when we want multiband compression, because that means we don't use it because we think we have to use multiband compression. We use it when we already know that we want this for specific reasons. And that's, as always, being intentional is key here. And yeah, I think we should. I think the best way to explain that is to just give you examples of things that we use multiband compression on and the specific use cases. And once again, it's really a fact that, and it might be depending on the genre. So, but in our world, in the rock world, sort of, it's very, if you watch tutorials or mix walkthroughs, it's actually pretty rare to see people use multiband compression. And if you see it, but they use it for very specific things like we do. But it's not that they use it all the time, or they use it on the mix bus or on in every single mix or master that they do. Maybe in the electronic world that it's a little different, but in our world it's definitely not something you have to do, and not something you have to do on every single source. Definitely not. So let's talk about some specific examples. And by the way, if you want to see what an example of a mixing session could look like, in my case, for example, then you can go to the selfrecordingband.com/template, and you get a free walkthrough video where you see my entire sort of workflow, my template, how I set up things, some of the go-to plugins that I use, the routing that I use. And you'll notice that there's probably multiband in there. I can't remember when exactly I made the video. It's not too long ago, so it's still relevant, but there might be multiband in there, but definitely not on every track, definitely not on every bus. And it's probably off by default. So if you want to see that, and if you want to see the tools that I actually use a lot and almost in every mix, then you can go to the selfrecordingband.com/template and watch that free video. Now on to the specific things. So you want to start that, Malcolm? Like things.
Sure.
Are there any things you always do with multiband compression, or is it often that you don't use any at all?
It is very common for me to sidechain the low end out of my bass guitar. So sidechain from a kick drum to the low band of my bass guitar. So on a multiband compressor, let's quickly describe what a multiband compressor is and looks like. It is like a compressor, but you can set individual frequency bands that compression is happening to. And depending on the tool you're using, that might be anywhere from 2 bands to like up to 6 or something is, I think, the most I've ever seen on something. But who knows? Maybe you can do more than that on some. But like in the case of this use case, which I think will help you understand it, I'm ducking the low end on the bass guitar whenever the kick drum plays. So I've created a frequency band in the multiband compressor that is only highlighting and selecting my low end, and that could be anywhere from 0 to 100 hertz, or maybe I'm going up to 200 hertz, or like whatever you want. And alternatively, you could select anywhere else as well. And then I'm feeding the kick drum signal into that, and whenever it detects that kick drum signal, I'm telling it to reduce the gain, like compress that frequency signal of that low end by whatever amount, and I can mess with the attack and release and ratio just like a normal compressor, but I'm only doing it to this one frequency band. So that's kind of interesting. So really I'm using it as kind of volume automation. I'm like ducking the low end in the use case of ducking the bass guitar out of the way of the kick rather than shaping it like a compressor might be normally used to do. Like when you just grab an 1176 to throw in something, you're more so shaping something. This isn't really that. This is like volume control more than anything. Yeah. But that's something that's cool about it, because if I did that with a normal compressor, that wasn't multiband, I would be ducking the entire signal, right? My entire bass track would be going down. In this case, I'm only ducking the low end, just a little bit, and it's so little that when I solo it, sometimes I can't even tell that it's happening. I'm just like, okay, I know it's happening, but I can't tell.
Peace
and
of
that's
mind.
kind of actually the goal. It's like a little loudness trick. It's going to let me squeeze it a little harder down the line. Sometimes you want pump and to audibly be able to hear it, but in this case, and it is something, like I said, this is something that I do quite a bit, and to varying degrees. Like I said, often I can't even really hear it.
It's also this peace of mind thing that, you're just avoiding buildups, and it's just keeping things under control. And for the most part, it's not doing a lot, but for the occasional spike, it just keeps things in check. It's like,
yeah, it's preemptive. Really, it's like a preemptive thing that I know I'm going to need to deal with later. And I should say that it's something I like to do right now, but I didn't do it for years and years. It's pretty recent into my workflow, honestly. And it's not like I wasn't getting work then. So I guess it's not crucial at all. It's just something I kind of am enjoying right now, and it solves that problem that way, opposed to solving it some other way down the chain.
Okay.
So yeah, side chaining my bass low end control. That's my main thing. What about you, Bendy? Do you have any common things that you use it for?
I know in the Mixbus episode, I didn't really mention it, but like recently I came back to using it on the Mixbus a little bit, but similar to, like, it's almost not worth mentioning it because it's doing so little. It's like half a dB gain reduction per band or so. It's almost like a peace of mind thing where I know that in case there's a buildup in some part that I don't really want, it just keeps things in check a little bit. It makes it more consistent, and I don't know. It's. I'm gonna explain that what I actually do there when we go through the list of how to set things up and stuff. But I'd say Mixbus. Yeah, I'd say Mixbus control is probably one that I do almost on every mix right now. But I could as well just turn it off, and it wouldn't be much of a difference. It's really a subtle thing that I play around with.
Now that you mention it, I totally have Lin MB, which is a Waves multiband. And I treat it like a color thing almost. It's hilarious. I turn it on, and if I've gain stage like I normally do, the meters barely twitch. And if I like it more, if it seems a little more locked in, I leave it on. I don't tweak it at all. And that's pretty often on my Mixbus as well. Same thing. It's just really looking for things that build up and jump out a little more than I want them to. It just kind of levels things off a little bit for me.
Yeah. The one thing I always do, I really almost always do, is bass low end control, which means I compress the low end of the bass separately from the rest of the bass because I often want to preserve a little more of the dynamics in the pick attack and the finger noise and whatever, and like those types of things. But I really want the low end to be super consistent, and there's multiple stages actually that the bass goes through in order to achieve that. But one of them is using a multiband where I only use the lowest band to just compress the low end of the bass, or multiple bass instruments. I do that on my bass bus. So if I have a bass synth and a bass guitar playing together or something, everything there and that goes into that sort of bass bus will get compressed, but just the low end, so that I have this solid foundation. That's something that I really almost always do. And there's different ways of doing that. You could split the signal up and use a normal compressor, but just only affect the low end. If you like duplicate the track and split it into low and high, you can do a multiband where it only affects the low end of the signal. Yeah, in my case, I do both most of the time. But on my bass bus, this is the one thing. On my bass bus, I have the multiband compressor with the low end band, and most of the time I use that for a more consistent fundamental notes thing. Yeah.
Right.
I want to say one thing real quick. I have to, after we've talked about the Mixbus thing. There is, to me, two different ways of using a multiband. There's tons of ways to using a multiband compressor, but, or as Brian Hood, my business coach, likes to say, there's what did he say? Like, there's 1,000 ways to mutilate a cat.
What the hell?
That was my reaction exactly. But that's what he kind of started saying now on our coaching calls, and I'm like, yeah. But
gets your attention.
Exactly. There's 1,000 ways to use a multiband compressor, but what I wanted to say is that there's basically two main approaches to me. The one is to use it to change the signal, like to change the balance, change the frequency balance, and to almost like using it like an EQ or a color thing. That's one approach. And then the other approach is use it like you would use a compressor, but just with the separation between the bands so that one band doesn't affect the other.
Right.
That's the difference to me. And what I do on the mix bus is I don't try to change the mix. I don't try to boost lows, boost highs, or change the mid-range. What I'm trying to do is what I do is I set the bands, sometimes I set them exactly the same. Like I would set a mix bus compressor. So I would have a typical mix bus compression setting on each of the 4 bands, for example. The only difference to normal mix bus compressor is that a loud kick drum will then only trigger the low band, and a loud snare drum will trigger the low mids, and the vocal the upper mids. And but it doesn't really change the song a lot. It just prevents things from pumping. So the loud kick doesn't move the cymbals anymore, or the loud snare drum doesn't duck the vocal as much anymore. So I use it as a very conservative, very standard sort of compressor thing, but in a more transparent way. It's actually a more transparent mix bus compressor in a way, the way I use it.
Yeah, used like that is very clever, and very clean, like you said.
Yeah. A very great starting point. So you can't do as much harm if you start with that. Just set all the bands to exactly the same thing, like a mix bus compressor, or like any compressor, and then watch and listen to what it does, and then you can start tweaking things based on the content of each band. But if you just start by treating it as a standard compressor, and you stop thinking about it as these 4 different things that you have to set differently, if you just think about it as a compressor and set it in the same, and then what you get is a more transparent way of compressing things, and you're not going to cause a ton of harm, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, okay, here's the misconception, though. People just heard that, and what they heard is, oh, it's like a mix bus compressor, but better.
No, it's not.
Right? And it's
totally right.
that it's not.
Yeah,
it's just not.
Like
that, a mixed bus compressor, like you said, a loud kick's going to make everything react to the whole frequency range is going to react on a normal mixed bus opposed to a multiband. But that can be good, and is something that is what we're very used to hearing and often want. So just because it is more powerful sounding doesn't mean more better.
No,
not more better.
No, I actually use both in my chain. So I use the mix bus compressor for the glue, for the pump, for the character, and for the reason I like it is precisely that it affects the whole thing, and that it makes things pump and react. So that's why I use a mix bus compressor. And sometimes, in addition to that, I might use the multiband just for some extra level control in a very transparent way. But that is not what I use a mix bus compressor for.
Right.
So you're totally right. You're totally right. So yeah, and I just wanted to say that because it's helpful for the whole episode. I think that people understand that it's not as complicated. Like a multiband compressor is just a compressor. It's like 4 compressors basically, but it works just like a compressor. And you can start by setting it like one, and then start tweaking. And we can get into some settings or some reasons to tweak individual bands, but overall, it's just another compressor.
Yeah, 100%.
Nothing magic about it. And if I say more transparent, there's also a cost to using it. It's not more transparent than not using anything, because there's filters involved between those bands, and those crossover filters and all that. All of it creates like artifacts or affects the sound in a way. So if you want the most transparent, most clean results, not using anything is always the best choice. So, everything comes at a cost. So that's why you have to be so careful with multiband.
Yeah. There's this little phase coherency cost to just having it living on the chain. So again, only grab it if you have a reason to be grabbing it. If you want multiband compression, that is again why we use it. Because you said you set it up to kind of transparently deal with like overages of like frequency buildup, I think guitars would be another cool place to talk about next, and using them on guitars. Most common place that I would consider using multiband compression on guitars is when it drops into like a palm muted chuggy part, dun 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 dun. Because there's usually this bloom of kind of low mids, low end at those parts that just muddies up the whole mix. And a multiband compressor can kind of just push that frequency range down a little bit to compensate for that. And used how I like it, it just makes it sound like it didn't happen. Like it makes it sound like it didn't get loud and weirdly bassy there. It just seems more even. So again, using it to just make something seem transparent and hiding the problem rather than really doing anything crazy. Like I never use a multiband compressor for anything aggressive now that I think about it.
Yeah. No, yeah, totally right. No, actually not. I mean, there is there are ways of using it like that. So there's the famous what's the Ableton preset called? The MOTT that Slate just built a whole plugin around, the famous multiband preset that makes things incredibly, it changes everything. It's very drastic and very, didn't you hear about that?
No.
There's this legendary multiband preset in, I think, Ableton that electronic music people have been using for a while. It's like, one of those, secrets. I don't know. And Slate just built a whole plugin based on that. It's a multiband compressor that's doing that Ableton preset on steroids, basically, with a couple of options that you can tweak. And it's actually pretty cool. I tried it, and it's really, it does something that no other of my tools does. So there is ways to use multiband compression creatively or radically, but I don't typically do that. And I wouldn't advise doing that unless you know what you're doing or unless you want to experiment with weird sounds. But
right.
Yeah.
Oh,
but I'm just saying you can use, you can absolutely use it to do these drastic things, but it's not the common thing to do.
Now, that sounds to me like a creative tool rather than a mixing tool, though, right? How they're using it there, which is cool. Yeah, totally encourage you to grab it and see what weird noises you can make. Like playing with sidechain stuff can be really creative. You can really create these weird pumping movement things. But what we're really talking about is practical use cases that we actually do use it for, in the hopes that you can understand why we use it and how it works and what its purposes are, and just kind of demystify the whole thing so it doesn't seem like this magic bullet and it's more of like a specialist tool. Yeah.
I would like to just burn through my list real quick with like action, because I have in mind a couple of things that I can tell you that are really specific, really targeted, because the more I think about it, most of the time that I use multiband compression, it's really very targeted problem solving. That's what it does. It like really solves specific problems for me. It's not very creative, but it's like, it's a problem solving tool. And I have very specific use cases for it. So the first one being what I said, a little bit of mix bus control, where I basically set it up like a mix bus compressor, but very transparent, only to avoid buildups in certain parts of the frequency spectrum. But it's doing very, very little. And I'm still experimenting with that. And I'm still not 100% sure if I actually want to continue using it, if I really think it's that much better or not. I'm trying, and I experimenting with it, and I feel better now if I see that it's keeping things under control. But it might be that I at some point stop using it again on the mix bus. So, but now the more specific things, bass low end control. As I said, low band, only controlling the fundamental notes, making it more consistent. Mm-hmm. The one thing to pay attention to there is try keeping the attack times as short as you can without causing distortion, because very short attack times will cause distortion on any bass signal. And you, for that purpose, like of keeping the low end consistent, you don't want to add additional distortion, or at least not too much of it. So keep the attack short enough so that it grabs every note quickly enough, but long enough so that you don't introduce unwanted distortion. Mm-hmm. And for the release, you probably have to use a fairly long release, because short release times on low end also cause distortion and sound pretty aggressive. So make it as short as you can get away with, but as soon as it starts distorting, keep it a little longer. And then you basically set the threshold to achieve the amount of gain reduction you want, the threshold and the ratio. And for me, it's like 2 to 3 dBs of sort of gain reduction. And then I make up for that on the output so that I have the same amount of bass that I had before, but more consistent by a couple of dB. That's how I approach this.
That in our like understanding compression episodes that we've done, we talked about like hearing the movement of a compressor. You got to figure that out before you dive into multiband compression, like as a prerequisite. If you aren't hearing what a compressor does just on its own, figure that out first. But one feature I really love about most multiband compressors is that you can solo the band that you're working on. So in the case of just working on the low end of the bass guitar or bass of the whole mix, whatever it is, you can just solo that and hear the movement a little more clearly. You want to take it in and out of solo, but that I can find to be really helpful for like shaping that attack and release time. Just hearing that band.
Yes. By the way, the compression episode is episode 61. So if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/61, that's where you'll find that, or just search it on your podcast app. So if you need some basics of if you need to learn about the basics of compression, basically, and what the controls actually do, and how to listen for what compression does to your music, then you can listen to that episode 61. All right. Then the next thing is what you already said too, the guitar mud control or build-up control, where it might be fine on open chords, but as soon as you play palm mutes, there's just too much. It's too boomy. You want to keep that under control. So again, one band of multiband compression, set it so that it actually affects the part of the spectrum that causes the problem, like the fundamentals of the guitar. And it can be a low shelf, sort of. It can also be a bell just around where those fundamentals are. And then you set it basically by ear to the amount of, you set it so that it's still like moving air and it's still big, but not like overly, like not overpowering everything else and not muddy and not covering up the whole low end. Basically, it's a feel thing, and I think it's actually not too hard to dial that in once you play around with it a little bit. It's just to keep things in check.
Totally. And it's a very specific problem. You'll know it when you hear it. You're like, okay, I got to deal with that at this one part of the song. This is the tool for it.
Yeah, totally. Then sibilance control is a pretty common one instead of a de-esser. A de-esser basically oftentimes is a multiband compressor with one band. So instead of using a dedicated de-esser, I sometimes like to use a multiband compressor. Sometimes one or the other works just better. So what I do there is I set it to I'm targeting a certain frequency or frequency range, and then I choose. I can basically tell the multiband compressor if it should just quote unquote listen to that band and then react to it, or if it should listen to the whole thing and react to it, or a specific sidechain input. So again, listen to the compression episode, or maybe we have one on sidechaining too. I think we have, where there's always the detection circuit and the actual audio circuit, and you can tell the compressor to listen to one thing and then react to the other thing. Listen to that episode to learn how that works, but basically I use it like a de-esser oftentimes.
Right. Yeah.
And that can be also mean to reduce or control sibilance on drums. If I think, like a good example would be, sometimes I think the crashes are fine and they might be a little darker, but the hi-hats might be overly bright and they are a little above the crashes in the spectrum. So I might use a multiband compressor and only use the very top end as a shelf or something, and only address the hi-hats so that the crashes stay the same, but when the hi-hat comes in, it ducks down, the top end a little bit on the overheads to just make the hi-hats less bright or less sticking out. That sort of sibilance control, it just goes to show that it's a powerful tool to solve problems. A normal compressor couldn't do that. But with the multiband, I can, even if I don't have a hi-hat mic, I can reduce the perceived volume or brightness of the hi-hats in the overheads if I just address the very top end, for example.
Totally. It's and by now I think people are kind of figuring out, okay, if they want to, compress just one frequency band, multiband compressor, that is, again, we're just going to keep repeating that mantra. That's what this tool is for.
Exactly. Then the next one, I don't even need to explain that really. It's like just an extra bit of consistency overall. Like whenever I need that on any signal, whenever I feel like something is a little inconsistent in some part of the spectrum, I can just compress that like I would with a normal compressor, but I don't have to affect the whole thing. I just affect that one part of it. Yeah. So again, we're not even using all the bands every time we use it. Oftentimes we're using multiband compressor to just use one band, as you just said. So
that's a great distinction. Is like you might have 4 bands there, but I usually only have one engaged because I only want to mess with one spot of the frequency range.
Yeah. By the way, episode 63 is the one where we explain sidechaining.
Okay, great.
So if you want to listen to that. So one great use case, one example that's, I think, almost a hack that I discovered I think I saw Kurt Ballou doing it, and I kept doing it ever since whenever I had this problem. I think it's simple, but so cool. When with real drums, there's always consistency issues with real drums because there are very few drummers who can play really consistent and like where all the pieces of the puzzle are just perfect. There's always going to be some inconsistencies. And one of the most common inconsistencies is that a kick drum, when it's played really hard, when it's played when the drummer plays really loud, it's going to have a lot of clicky attack and less low end, especially if they stick the beater to the head. Mm-hmm. If they play a quieter hit and the beater bounces off the head and it's like a quieter hit overall, you're going to have a more boomy, longer sort of low end with less clicky attack. And if you want a more overall consistent kick drum sound, because like the drummer does these things like rather not so in an unintentional way, or if it just want to have a little more control over that, then what you can do is you can set up a multiband compressor on the kick drum with 2 bands, or actually you have to do it with something like Pro MB, like FabFilter, where you can set one of the bands to be an expander, so it doesn't duck down, but it adds volume to it. And then you can set it so that you're basically creating a dynamic tilt thing, EQ thing, where on a loud hit, the compressor will duck down the top end to reduce the clicky sound and to make that more consistent, to have a more consistent beater attack. And it will at the same time, let me think about it. Yeah, when you above a certain threshold, when the hit is loud, it will duck down on the clickiness. It will make the click, control it more, and you have a more consistent beater attack. And at the same time, it will increase bottom end, so it will duck down the top end, and it will boost the low end for every loud hit. And for the quiet hits, it stays the same. So that way you have a more consistent sounding kick drum, because the louder hits don't sound clicky and thin anymore compared to the lower hits.
Yeah.
So that's just one example of creating an extra bit of consistency. And you can take that approach and apply it to everything else. It's like, just be creative and think about what you want trying to solve, and then you can come up with these types of fixes to problems. Can be a clicky bass finger attack or something, can be string noise, can be pick noise, whatever you want to isolate and control or make more consistent. That's just a common thing. Overall, very targeted problem solving. And then, as you said, sidechaining, ducking specific parts can be part of it, but I don't really do that a whole lot. I gotta be honest.
Right. Yeah, on the consistency thing, just two more examples, and I won't go into the technical solving, but I think that people hearing that example you just gave could then imagine applying that to something like a vocal recording that is got proximity effect problems, where they're getting too close to the mic and it's getting like really bassy all of a sudden. Multiband compressor can be a great fix for that, right? Because you can combat that proximity effect. Acoustic guitars are another one that is pretty easy to run into that same problem with even. The guitar, as an acoustic guitar moves as they're playing it, that can create all kind of weird frequency jumps. And a multiband compressor can be a very useful tool to combat that type of problem if it's needed. Ideally, it's not needed, because it's one thing to say that you can use a multiband compressor to fix stuff like that, but often that inconsistency is so inconsistent that it's really hard to dial something in to actually be able to solve the problem.
Yes.
So again, getting things right at the source, very important. But yeah, I think people are probably seeing like this is a tool for solving individual problems. It's not like a magic piece of gear that just makes things sound better. It's a very precise problem solver. The last one on my list, because my list is essentially the same as yours. We use them the same way. It's a tool for a job. But the last thing I think could be worth mentioning is using it as a transient shaper. So most recently for me, I wanted the kick attack in the verse of the song to be less intense. It was cutting through great on the big loud parts of the song, but on the verse it was just too in your face. So I just engaged the multiband compressor to shape the attack, the click of that drum differently in the verses. And it just made it like, it was just like one way of really subtly making it less pokey and being like, okay, it's just less in focus, less distracting for the verse now. So awesome. You can use it to do cool things like that as well. Just shape.
Sorry, just to get a concept right, you automated that, or you created a second track and treated the two kick drums differently, basically?
I automated it in. So it just bypassed the plugin until that part of the song. That was how I did it. But you could totally just have it on a different track or whatever. That would totally work. Often, usually for that problem, I use an EQ that just cuts some high end. But in this case, it was like, no, it just needs to be shaped differently, which sounds different. So transient response is something you can control with compressor. So with a multiband compressor, you in theory can control the transient response of the different frequency bands, right? Worth thinking about, because it could be a problem you encounter. So.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point here. Some of these problems that we mentioned, you might just be able to fix that with EQ, honestly, and it might work perfectly well and might be transparent. And these are just one way of solving these, not the only way. Sometimes it's the best way, not always. So again, now we've told you all the things that multiband compression is useful for, but at the same time, we still believe that you don't have to use it. And most important thing is you have to be intentional about it. You have to know why you want to use it. Then fix that problem that you're hearing, and then check if it really did the job that you wanted. So like you said, Malcolm, you might set it so that it reacts to, so that it treats or it solves the inconsistency problem, but you have to check if it really does that, or if it creates unwanted side effects, if the cost of it is actually higher than the benefit, and if it really does what you want it to do. Because sometimes these things are not so easy to dial in. Sometimes you think it should react to the sibilance or whatever, but turns out it only reacts to other parts of the vocal, but not the sibilance, and then it just doesn't work for the job. That's often the case. Also with dynamic EQ, same thing. Sometimes I think, okay, if I just use this one band on this frequency, it should be solved, and then I do it, and then turns out it doesn't react to the S's at all, but instead it tucks down something else, and I don't need that. So you have to check if it really does the job, if it really solves the problem for you, and you got to be intentional. And if you can't hear a difference, or if you don't really know why you're using it, then you probably shouldn't be using it.
Totally.
Yeah. When in doubt, just turn it off, honestly.
Yeah.
And
Benny and I's, both of our homework is to reassess using it on our mix bus as our little static thing. We both need to go look at that and make sure we actually like it.
Yeah, honestly, really. I was planning on doing some blind tests with Thomas, actually, to figure out if we both agree that the version with it on is really always better. Because it looks good to me and it makes sense logically, and I feel good about it having it on that and controlling that 0.5 dB or something per band and the peace of mind. But maybe it comes at a cost that I'm not aware of right now, and that I shouldn't actually be using it that way. So
I've got a theory on this, because it's something that I've been messing with too, and we'll report back on this on a future episode, everyone. But my theory is that because it does make things more static, consistent. That is for sure. And that
I can hear the difference. I'm not saying that I can't hear it. I'm just not sure if I really like it better.
Yeah, it makes it more pleasing, but I think it comes at a cost to punch in a way. Like density and punch is lost, I think. That's kind of what I'm hearing, and sometimes that's totally worth it. But I want to see if that's what you perceive as the difference as well when we're using it this subtly. So report back. We'll get to the bottom of this.
Do you? Yeah. Final thought on this while we're at it. Do you think that maybe going because I've tried that and I think that solves that problem at least a little bit. Do you think that if you pay more attention and you more carefully dial in the individual bands to sort of combat that, do you think that could solve it? So what I mean is, if you have a perceived loss of like punch, for example, I thought I could maybe fix that by sort of increasing the attack time on the lower mid-range, for example, to let more of the snare punch through, and reducing the release time to make it more aggressive. But like maybe having the attack time very short on the sibilants up top to make that smoother. So, change what I was saying. You start with the same settings basically, but then you go in and tweak them to match the needs of each individual band. And I sort of did that in an attempt to get the consistency that I wanted, while letting the punchy stuff still through, that sort of thing. But I'm still not sure if it's entirely solving the issue.
I would almost definitely not do that, because it sounds like it would take way too much time. It sounds way too tweaky, and it sounds like, okay, like at that point we probably should do something else. Like it's like an earlier in the mix problem, right?
Yes,
and
definitely.
Then the only other problem I see with that is that I bet it would work really well, but only for that part of the song, So like if the tempo of the song or part gets more complex or something, it could really fall apart on you. Which is kind of another reason that we probably should reassess using multiband on the mix bus like we're doing, because it's so program dependent. So we need to check it at multiple stages throughout the mix to make sure it's serving. Yeah, we got our own homework to do. It's great.
Absolutely, yeah. And I do that, and I think that all is the reason for me only using it in such a subtle way and never going beyond like point something dB, which kind of makes me think, why use it at all then? But like that's part of the reason, because as soon as I push it harder, it gets too obvious. So yeah, maybe I don't need it at all. But yeah, that's the other thing is, at a certain point, and I don't want to sound arrogant, but of course with experience and at a certain point where you are happy with your mixes and stuff, you want to improve and squeeze out the next like final couple of % or whatever of quality, and you try new things, and it's like a very subtle thing. So for me, and I think when you're professionally mixing, it makes sense to experiment with that and do these kinds of tests. But when you're just learning to mix and you're just starting out, don't even worry about all the things that we just mentioned. It's like you've got lots and lots of other things to worry about. And that's honestly probably true for myself too. But I just keep looking for things that I can improve or new things I can try. That's why I do these things.
Yeah. If there's one thing that I hope that most of the listeners get from this is that they can stop thinking about it for a while, honestly. It's like, okay, we listened to this, we got a better understanding of what it is. Now I'm going to focus on other stuff and just forget about multiband compression for the foreseeable future. That's kind of best case scenario, I think, is just take it off your plate.
Awesome. Very cool. As always, though, if you have your own trick, it could be a problem-solving thing that you figured out, could be a creative thing, whatever. If you have your own trick, your own hack, your own thing that you like, that you use on certain things, let us know. Shoot us a message or post in the community. If you go to the selfrecordingband.com/community, share it there with us because we always like to learn about these new tricks and things and that you like and you do. And maybe there is something we should try ourselves that we haven't heard about. So,
totally. Let
us know.
All right. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye.